So welcome everyone to the first PPV launch of 2021, which is the launch of Katherine Zubovich's Moscow Monumental, and to my very overdue UCL launch for my book, The Palace Complex, which was actually published in 2019. So it's not a very new book. And we're very excited to have Caroline Humphrey and Yuri Slezkine here to respond to our books. And the event will be chaired by Dr. Maria Mileva, who's lecturer in art history at the Courtauld Institute and the co-convener of PPV, Perverting the Power Vertical, with myself and Denis Maximov, and Peter Zusi, who's associate professor in Czech and Slovak literature, Czech with Slovak literature, sorry, Peter.
Imperative now.
At CEAS, and also the director of the Fringe Centre for the study of social and cultural complexity. So we'll start, and we're very lucky to also have Professor Nicola Miller, who is the new director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at UCL as of September. Is that correct? So let's start. I'll hand over to Masha perhaps to introduce, and then we'll kind of get the program. We'll do introductions, and then Katherine and I will deliver short presentations about our books. Then we'll have responses from Caroline and Yuri, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. So, but if you do have questions that you think of during the presentations or during the responses, do feel free to just write them down and put them in the chat whenever you think of them. And if you want to ask your question verbally later on, please indicate your willingness to do so in the chat, because it's going to be very hard for us to keep track of raised hands in the Zoom format. So use the chat format for questions, the chat box. Okay, thanks, Masha. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Michał. And it is my great pleasure to kick off this very exciting double book launch. Thank you for the introduction and welcome to your computer screens, but for me, we're in London. It is a lovely evening, sunny evening, blue sky. And I am here as a co-host of PPV, which stands for Perverting the Power Vertical, Aesthetics and Politics in the Global East. And PPV is a nomadic research and event platform that Michał and I set up in 2018. We've been roving nomadically around for some time now. And we meet both in real space, but in current events online, virtually, where we kind of collectively try to identify, analyze, and make sense of power verticals. And whilst we do that, we devote most of our time to ridiculing, twisting, resisting, and queering, but more, I think, importantly, perverting those verticals, but also kind of fake horizontals, and identifying what the power dynamics look like in both aesthetics and politics. Our latest project that we launched online is called Piramida, with triple M. It's a cyber Piramida project, an interdisciplinary transmedia exhibition that is you can find online, and all of that you can find on ppv.life. So it is a great pleasure to co-host for us together with Michał and colleagues at CEAS and IAS this event. So I'm going to pass over to Peter for the next welcome remarks.
Thank you, Masha. My name is Peter Zusi, and I'm the director of the Fringe Centre, which is the second of these layered host institutions that you're being introduced to right now. The Fringe Centre was set up 5 years ago at CEAS, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL. And the Fringe Centre is a deliberate oxymoron And one of the things we're very interested in is ways in which notions of sort of centers and peripheries can be put into sort of productive challenge or questioning. The other thing that the Fringe Center, FRINGE, stands for is it's an acronym. So it stands for fluidity, resistance, invisibility, neutrality, gray zones, and elusiveness. And those are just sort of catchwords to try and describe the sorts of phenomena that we're interested in, or the sorts of methodologies that we're interested in promoting. And when Masha and Michał started Perverting the Power Vertical several years ago, we were thrilled to be able to cooperate and sort of collude with them on that, because it was a project and is a project that fits very much within the Fringe priorities. I'm really looking forward to this book launch. Both of these books just seem to, first of all, work really well together in a joint launch, but to raise these sort of questions about global aesthetics, and in particular, rethinking the idea of a global East, and rethinking about the kind of categories that that aesthetics of the 20th century in particular have been thought through, I think is really quite promising. In the chat, I'm just one little self-advertisement thing. I'm putting up a link to the Fringe book series at UCL Press, which may be of interest to some people. These are all free downloads, PDF, if you wish. It's all open access. There are several titles there that may interest audience members. I'll just draw attention to one in particular, because it's a book that was co-edited by Michał, called Recentering the City. So feel free, please, to look at those at your leisure. I believe that is all I'm going to say. I will pass now the microphone on to the third introducer, and that's Nicola Miller, professor of Latin American history here at UCL, but also, and most importantly in this context, the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies. So Nicola, on to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And yes, it's such a pleasure for the IAS to be hosting this first in a whole series of book launches from PPV, I think. The IAS promotes cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary work across arts, humanities and social sciences and beyond. But what's especially brilliant, I think, about the work that PPV and Fringe do, you kind of bring together two of our biggest areas of concern, which is relationship between politics and aesthetics, and the whole project that we've been engaged with over the last 5 years or so of remapping area studies. So our collaboration with you and all our colleagues at CEAS is really particularly important to the work that we do overall. So it's really lovely to be here and to see these two books being launched, and I really look forward to the discussion. And I promise you all that at some point you will be able to come into our lovely space on South Corridor in UCL and be given a glass of decent wine to celebrate in person. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think we are now ready to start, and I believe Katherine is going first. Yeah, okay, great. So whilst Katherine is getting her slides up, just very short introduction to say that Katherine Zubovich is a historian of Russia and former Soviet Union, and she's an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo at the Department of History. So over to you, Katherine.
Thank you so much, Masha, for the introduction, and to UCL and PPV and Fringe and IIS for hosting this event. I'm really delighted to start us off. But before I jump in, I just want to thank Professors Caroline Humphrey and Yuri Slezkine for joining us today, and to thank Michał for inviting me to join forces with him for this book launch. I've been thinking about my own book in relation to yours, Michał, over the past few years, but it's really fun to have this opportunity to continue those conversations together in a celebratory mood today. So thanks so much. So my book is called Moscow Monumental, Soviet Skyscrapers and Urban Life in Stalin's Capital. And this is a book about Soviet skyscraper building. It's a history of Stalinist architectural monumentalism and its consequences. In my book, I examine efforts during the Stalin era to transform Moscow into a showcase capital city, a city worthy of its status as center of the Soviet Union, but also as capital of the growing socialist world. Moscow Monumental looks at the design and construction of a ring of skyscrapers in the Soviet capital. These buildings were constructed following Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War. And at the moment of their design and construction, these buildings were part of a larger effort to rebuild the country after a devastating conflict. But they were also meant to project Soviet strength at a moment of the country's post-war ascendancy to superpower status. And so it was on January 13th, 1947, that the USSR Council of Ministers issued a decree calling for the construction of 8 skyscrapers in Moscow. And these buildings were placed in sort of a ring around the city. And to introduce you to them briefly, although I know that a number of you on this call already know these buildings, I'll start with the one closest to the Kremlin. That was the Zaryada office building. This structure was never built to completion, but as I discussed in chapter 5 of my book, the Zaryada neighborhood, one of the oldest and densest areas in Moscow at the time, was demolished and cleared to make way for this building in the late 40s and early 1950s. Moving along the banks of the Moskva River, we come to the Michiskaya Embankment residential tower. That structure, as you can see in this photograph, was completed. And as I discuss in chapter 7 of my book, new residents moved into this structure starting in late 1952 and early 1953. To the north, a second residential tower located at the Red Gates was completed not long thereafter. And the Hotel Leningrad was built nearby, next to one of Moscow's large railway terminuses. If we were then to travel westward along the Garden Ring Road, we'd come to the Uprising Square residential building on our right. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs would be on our left. And across the river to the west, next to another railway terminal, is the Hotel Ukraine. The outermost skyscraper, the tallest of them all, is of course Moscow State University, built to overlook the city from its perch on the Lenin or Sparrow Hills. So that first skyscraper decree of January 1947, the order that initiated this entire project, it listed the required heights and locations of these 8 buildings, and it gave instructions about each building's purpose, whether it should serve as a hotel, a residential tower, or an office building, or a combination of 2 of these 3 uses. The decree also offered some parameters for design. It stated plainly that Moscow's new structures must not repeat the famous examples of foreign multi-story buildings. In other words, Moscow's architects were not allowed to build American skyscrapers. They were supposed to be building Soviet tall buildings. And in fact, the Russian word for skyscraper, nebaskryb, was deliberately avoided in all official discussions of Moscow's tall buildings. The decree of 1947 also stated that Moscow's new buildings should draw on the historical character of the city. Moscow was, after all, celebrating its 800th anniversary in 1947. And it stated that these buildings should take their cue from the design of the earlier Palace of Soviets. The Palace of Soviets was a project dating to the 1930s, a period that I explore in the first chapters of the book. By 1947, the Palace of Soviets had still not been completed, and the new post-war vision for Moscow took that singular tower from the 1930s and multiplied it across the cityscape. The plan in 1947 was now to complete these 8 high-rises and then to return to the Palace of Soviets in order to finally build it as the 9th and tallest tower that would stand in the center of Moscow. And in fact, the administration for the construction of the Palace of Soviets, the organization created in the early 1930s to build the palace, it was tasked in 1947 with building 2 of Moscow's post-war skyscrapers. So those Palace of Soviets design offices retooled and got to work on building Moscow State University and the Zaryada building, which was never completed. Ultimately, 7 out of these 9 planned buildings were completed in the 1950s, and these structures forever transformed the cityscape of Moscow. At the time that they were built, Moscow was a city of about 4 million people. Today, Moscow is home to over 12 million. But even today, in a city 3 times its post-war size, Moscow's Stalinist skyscrapers stand out on the horizon. These buildings remain the landmarks of daily life in the city. And those of you who have traveled to or worked in, lived in Moscow, you know these Stalinsky Vysotki well. Their matching silhouettes gaze at one another across the modern city below. They have this almost magnetic quality, drawing you into their orbit, whether you like it or not. And for some, the effect that these buildings have on the individual is really menacing. So historian Katherine Zubovich, for example, writes that Stalin's skyscrapers, quote, loom out of the urban smog like evil trolls. Others have more positive associations and memories of these buildings. But no matter who you ask, it's undeniable that these buildings do a lot of symbolic work in the city of Moscow, even today. And it's really tempting to stay on the surface of these structures and to engage what are ultimately really interesting questions of aesthetics, questions of style and symbolism. But when I started reading archival files about these structures, other kinds of questions began to emerge for me. When I started the research on this project, I imagined that the main actors of this history would be the architects and engineers of these buildings and a handful of Soviet officials, including, of course, Stalin at the top, but also figures like Lavrentiy Beria, who in 1947 was put in charge of overseeing Moscow's skyscraper project as a whole. And this cast of characters is certainly present in Moscow Monumental, but there were whole other groups of people that I didn't anticipate writing about until working in the archives. These other groups led me to think not just about architectural monumentalism, but about monumentalism and its consequences. And so the book that I've written is organized chronologically. It moves from early chapters on the 1930s through the wartime period and into the post-war years, ending with a chapter on de-Stalinization. But the book is also organized according to groups of people. Early on, those architects and engineers are in the foreground, but as the book progresses, those actors sort of move aside to make space for other kinds of voices. Chapter 5 draws on letters written by displaced residents to Soviet state officials in order to highlight the experiences of the tens of thousands of Muscovites who were displaced to make room for Stalin's skyscrapers. And I focus on in this chapter on the central Zaryada district, this neighborhood that was home to about 10,000 people in 1947. All of those neighbors would be moved in preparation for skyscraper building. Construction work on the Zaryada building was soon interrupted, however, when remnants from the deep Russian past were unearthed in the soil beneath the site of the future skyscraper. Work on this central skyscraper was put on pause from 1949 to 1950, while archaeological excavations were conducted on the site. In chapter 6, I turn to the experiences of construction workers, a group that included many women as well as incarcerated laborers in the Gulag system. Their grievances and daily realities were really at odds with the idealized images of skyscraper construction workers, the sort of hero Vysotniki that circulated for popular consumption in the post-war years in paintings like the one you can see on the top left of the screen. In chapter 7, I turn to Soviet elites. Unlike construction workers or displaced residents, these elites benefited from Moscow's skyscraper construction by receiving luxury apartments in the city's new residential towers. They moved into those apartments just as the Stalin era was coming to a close. So in thinking about our 2 books together, one of the elements that stands out for me is the contrast between Warsaw's open, public-serving palace of culture and the much more closed, elite enclave-like nature of Moscow's Vysotki. These buildings all emerged from the common impulses of Stalinist gigantomania, but the results in Moscow and Warsaw were really very different. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Michał.
Katherine, thank you so much for that fascinating introduction to your book. I had already actually listened to a podcast where you introduced your book as well, which was brilliant, and I highly recommend that to everyone. I'll post it as well in the chat. But without further ado, our second book is Michał Murawski's, and Michał is a lecturer in critical area studies at SEAS, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL in London, and he's an anthropologist of architecture and of cities. So Michał, over to you. Oh, you're on mute, Michał.
Sorry, I never learn. Thank you very much, Katherine, for the introduction, and for Masha for the introduction, and Katherine for the presentation, and for drawing all those parallels between the two projects as well. And I'll try and elaborate on a couple of those parallels too. And thank you also once again to Caroline and to Yuri for joining us. And this is especially exciting for us, as I don't know if some people here realize that in fact Caroline was my PhD supervisor and Yuri was Katherine's PhD advisor. So this is additionally kind of nerve-wracking but exciting as a prospect for responses. So I'm going to time myself to make sure I don't go over too long. The title of my book, Palace Complex, has intentionally it's supposed to kind of suggest a sort of, it's supposed to have two kinds of connotations or associations. It's supposed to connote a kind of psychological fixation, a sort of a psychopathological obsession of Warsaw, of an entire urban organism on one building, as in the obsession of a psychic organism on an element of childhood psychosexual development. But it's also intended to emphasize the extent to which the palace is able to exert this kind of, it's able to trigger this kind of complex, it's able to trigger this kind of fixation or obsession because of the extraordinary complexity of functions that are contained within it. And can everybody see my presentation? No.
That's good. That's good.
Thank you for alerting me to that. The complexity is also to do with all of the different things, all of the different functions that the palace contains. And in a sense here, the Polish or Russian words kompleksowość or kompleksność are more meaningful than the English word complexity, because they also suggest a kind of comprehensiveness of social functions, a kind of totality of social functions that are contained within the palace. And this is another sense in which the palace as a building is very different to the 7 built towers of Moscow. And this is the phrase, the palace complex, isn't one that I invented. It's one that I kind of found in the field. It's a sort of emic term taken from the field in a sense, or a vernacular term. It's used quite often by Warsaw administrators, especially architects, to signify a kind of pathological presence of Warsaw on the palace, a kind of a pathology that needs to be a cathexis that needs to be overcome. So here you have the mayor of Warsaw, the then mayor of Warsaw, Hanna Gronkiewicz, in 2008, standing together with the late British Iraqi architect Zaha Hadid at a press conference at which Zaha presented a tower that was supposed to be built before the financial crisis obviously derailed the plans, which was supposed to be taller than the Palace of Culture. And at this press conference, the mayor declared, finally, Warsaw will have its own. Oh, I'm paused again. I don't know what. I think it's because I moved the screen from my presentation from one screen to the other. Can you see it now? Great. So at this press conference, the mayor said, finally, Warsaw will have its own Manhattan. We will overcome our Palace of Culture complex, thanks to this tower that Zaha Hadid was supposed to produce. And it's a phrase that's been used before. So in another context, the deputy mayor in 2007 said, we finally have to overcome this palace complex to remove the palace from its pedestal. It should be one tall building among many, not the only one. So it's a kind of a phrase that's used a lot. An important thing to recognize is the sort of origin of the Palace of Culture as a gift, as a free gift from the Soviet Union to Poland, and in particular as a free gift from Stalin to Poland. And in the rhetoric, in the journalism, in the literature of the time, the emphasis on the freeness, on the kind of free lunchist nature of the palace is really rhetorically laid heavy. And we know, anthropologists and others know, that the more you emphasize how much a gift is free and how little you have to repay that gift, actually how much more screwed you are, in a sense, how much more there is to repay. And if you can't repay that, then obviously you're sort of within the clutches of that gift. So the Palace of Culture, the sort of rhetorical premium on the freeness of the gift was, very much a sign of the extent to which the Palace of Culture played a role in the sort of geopolitical context of the time, in the reproduction in the context of Warsaw of a piece of Moscow, effectively. And the Palace of Culture really was a kind of an element in the Moscowification of Warsaw. And even though it resembles very closely the 7 built towers in Moscow, as this slide hopefully illustrates, the building on the left is the Palace of Culture, whereas the 7 on the side are the Moscow towers. In a sense, its social and spatial function in the cityscape of Warsaw was supposed to be different to the function of the 7 towers. It was supposed to be a function much closer to that of the Palace of the Soviets, in the sense that the Palace of Culture really was supposed to be the kind of supreme building, the ore building, the center of the kind of cosmos of Warsaw, and contains many more functions too than the 7 realized Wysotsky, which mostly have 1, 2, or 3 functions. I mean, the university has more, but the multifunctionality of the palace really distinguishes it from the Moscow towers, and its role, its role at the very center of the Warsaw cityscape was also a conscious a relocation of the imagined future spatial organization of Moscow onto the context of Warsaw. So here you have illustrations from a book written by Edmund Goldsamt, who was a very influential Stalinist architectural ideologue of the time, who during the war trained in Moscow at Marhi, and wrote his master's thesis on the socialist realist reconstruction of Warsaw after the war. And he produced these 2 fantastic, a friend of his drew these fantastic images in the book of Moscow organized around the Palace of the Soviets and Warsaw organized around the Palace of Culture correspondingly. And another thing that I'm kind of exploring now, and I'm particularly interested in, is the extent to which this sort of gift culture of the Palace of Culture, and the way in which this gift culture is plugged into various types of aesthetics and politics, continues to exist today to an extent. And my current book project is on Zaryada, another district that Katherine devotes a chapter to, the history of, or the greater part of a chapter of the history of, in her book. Now I'm working on the kind of current architectural and political life of Zaryada, and this sort of spontaneous gifting of Park Zaryada by Vladimir Putin to Sergei Sobyanin, or rather to the people of Moscow, is rhetorically not dissimilar to this act of spontaneous gifting of the Palace of Culture to the people of Poland. And this social condenser status, so this Palace of the Sovietness of the palace is most clearly expressed, as I mentioned before, in this multiplicity of functions, in the fact that there are museums of technology, gymnasiums, palaces of youth, swimming pools, concert halls, dramatic theaters, puppet theaters, universities, a viewing tower. People have weddings in the Palace of Culture. The UFO Society of Warsaw meets in a cupboard under the staircase in the Palace of Culture. So this kind of hive-like social life, this kind of social condenser-like existence of the Palace of Culture is also something that I think distinguishes it from the Moscow towers. And today, the other thing that's interesting, the other thing that I kind of emphasize in my book, is the way in which the Palace of Culture still continues to do exactly more or less what it was supposed to do. So these public functions that were built into it, designed into it by the ideologues of the time, this totalizing relationship that it was supposed to have with the cityscape, continues to exist. Those functions, as opposed to many other things in Warsaw, haven't been privatized, and they function more or less as they were supposed to then. And also the various grand architectural plans for normalizing the Palace of Culture, for overcoming the palace complex, for working through this fixation, have all failed. So these various schemes for surrounding the Palace of Culture with a circle or ring of even taller skyscrapers, as well as private schemes dreamt up by individual Varsovians. I met several middle-aged men who showed me these glass pyramids that they wanted to build on top of the Palace of Culture. For some reason, this was a popular trope among a certain age group and a certain demographic in Warsaw. None of these plans have been realized, and the palace complex still reigns. And I'm not going to read all these quotes out because I'm running out of time, and it's not that interesting to read quotes out, but they all really, they can be found in the book, and this notion of the complex and of the palace complex is really emphasized a great deal. And this is what the surroundings of the Palace of Culture look like today. None of these plans have been built, and there is this kind of this permanent temporariness of this site. This is the former honor tribune from which the Politburo was supposed to wave to the masses, and it's now a kind of temporary bus stop. A lot of this is determined by the political economy of the palace, the kind of the proprietorial arrangements of the surroundings of the Palace of Culture, the battles over the restitution of property in the area of the palace. And this is something that I try to kind of lay out in the book too. This is a photograph of Tadeusz Kos, who's the descendant of Warsaw property owners, who was the first person to regain ownership of a plot of land in the vicinity of the palace. And he's photographed here standing in a statue, in one of the Palace of Culture's own vacant statue niches, as if ready for him. And I'll just finish up. I mean, the Palace of Culture has been more and more accepted into the fabric, even though it's still an object of fixation or fascination, but it's also been more or less accepted and has become more or less a popular building, a building of a kind of positive. The Palace of Complex has a kind of generative function as well as a pathologizing one in the cityscape of Warsaw, and the Palace of Culture has become accepted more, especially following the collapse, the end, the death of the giver. The obligation to reciprocate also died in a sense. So this association of the Palace of Culture with some sort of alien power to whom fealty has to be paid opened the way, in a sense, for the social totality of the palace to remain, but for this kind of colonial or otherwise geopolitical relationship of domination to fade away. But the palace was kind of re-politicized, or it gained a new agonism or a new negativity following the rise to power of the current law and justice regime, who, for example, replaced the image of the palace from the flagship TV news channel. The newscaster used to stand in front of the photograph of the clock on the Palace of Culture, and now he or she stands, well, it is always he or she in the context of contemporary Poland, in front of the Royal Tower clock. And the most kind of dramatic act of this re-agonization of the surrounding of the palace was an act of self-immolation that took place here in 2018. A man from a provincial town in Silesia burnt himself to death in front of the Palace of Culture in direct and explicit protest at the law and justice regime's kind of increasing authoritarianism and bigotry and xenophobia, distributing a manifesto to people gathered on the square at the time of his act of immolation, of self-immolation, directly enacting a scene described in a very well-known book, A Minor Apocalypse by Tadeusz Konwicki, in which a dissident also sets himself on fire in front of the Palace of Culture. So this act of literature from a 1970s book set in the 80s was made real in the context of the current Polish the current Polish political predicament. And interestingly too, the palace is disliked much more by men, and I apologize for the kind of strategic binary nature of these statistics, but the Palace of Culture is disliked much more heavily and enthusiastically by men, especially by young men, than by women. Men are 3 times more likely to not like the palace. Men are also 2.5 times more likely to think that Warsaw needs a taller skyscraper than the palace. And men are 2.5 times more likely to think that the palace has to be destroyed than women. So there's a kind of gendered nature of the relationship of the palace to Warsaw cityscape. And also the palace has now become this kind of symbol or object of resistance to some extent on the Warsaw cityscape. So here it is during the recent marches, the protests in Warsaw for women's reproductive autonomy in protest at the now implemented plan to ban abortion in Poland. The palace, with the agreement of the mayor of Warsaw, was used as a projection screen onto which to project the main symbol of the women's protests in Warsaw. So I'll end here. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Peter for the next round of introductions.
Great, thank you, Michał. What I think is very clear from these 2 descriptions of these books is that we're looking not only at 2 very fascinating books, but also at 2 projects that work really well together in a joint book launch, which sometimes have sort of patchwork feel to them. But here, the sort of parallels are obvious, as well as the important differences. And it does seem like that unbuilt palace of the Soviets is sort of looming in ghostly fashion behind all of these different this different material that you're talking about. Anyway, we now are very privileged to have 2 eminent speakers, interlocutors, respondents, who also, as Michał has pointed out, happen to be the former supervisors and supervisors of the PhD projects that these books grew out of. So that is interesting. The first respondent will be Yuri Slezkine, who is a professor at the graduate school at UC Berkeley and a senior research fellow at St. Edmund Hall, University of Oxford, and at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration in Moscow. His most recent books are The House of Government, a saga of the Russian Revolution, published by Princeton University Press in 2017, and The Jewish Century, also published by Princeton in 2004. His first book was titled Arctic Mirrors, Russia and the Small Peoples of the North, which came out with Cornell in 1994. So without further ado, Yuri, I pass the microphone on to you.
Thank you, Peter, very much for your introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's really a tremendous pleasure for me to be here with you and to be holding Katherine's beautifully produced and impressively heavy book in my hands. Michal's book hasn't arrived yet, I'm afraid, but my PDF version looks very attractive and reads beautifully too. I remember the day Katherine and I met. We had lunch in a little terrace cafe overlooking the San Francisco Bay with the Transamerica Pyramid, still the tallest building in the city at the time, presiding over the skyline. I didn't know at the time that it was a sign of things to come. Katherine was thinking about writing her dissertation about the Khrushchev mikrorayony residential districts, perhaps about Soviet architecture in Kyrgyzstan. But that pyramid kept coming back in a variety of guises. And Katherine kept reaching higher and higher until she found her scale her voice and her perfect topic. And I think at about the same time, her husband, Gene, who is a high-rise in his own right. If I may be allowed to wax a little sentimental, nostalgic, those buildings have organized my own life almost as inescapably as they structure Moscow. I was born when the last of those buildings, the Ukraina Hotel, was about to be finished. My first kindergarten was located in Devetinsky Pereulok in the shadow of the Insurrection Square high-rise. And sometimes on our way home on Saturday evenings, and it was a boarding kindergarten, my grandmother and I would go into the unimaginably large grocery store on the ground floor of that building, Gastronome number 15. We would stay there too long, but I actually didn't mind very much because I loved looking at the live fish. When I was 14, my parents and I moved from a communal apartment not far from the Red Gate high-rise to one of those Khrushchev residential districts in southwestern Moscow that Katherine was going to write her dissertation about. And a few years later, I went to Moscow University. My department, the philology department, was in a new glass building, which had just been completed in, I think, 1970. But I remember going to some administrative offices in the main building, marveling at the size of the doors and losing hope of ever getting into one of those elevators. And I sort of remember visiting some classmates in their dorm rooms in one of the wings. Or rather, I remember going in, but don't really remember leaving because we drank so much in those days. Some years later, I got a job at Progress Publishers on Smolensky Boulevard, across the ring road from the Ministry of External Affairs high-rise. And this seemed appropriate since my main job was to translate political texts into Portuguese. There were 6 or 7 of us working in the Portuguese section there. We were young, carefree, outwardly cynical, but secretly in love. And a couple of times a week, we would walk over to the Ukraina Hotel to have one of their delicious prefixed lunches and feel a little decadent. And then I left for Lisbon. But before I did, my parents and I moved to a new apartment next to the Leningrad Hotel. In 1997, I went back there to do research for my book about the much lower House of Government. The ground floor of the hotel had turned into a casino, and I remember going in once to have a drink in there just to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid of all those armed men. One of my interviews for the book on the House of Government took place in the Kotelnicheskaya Nabережная high-rise, where I'd been there lots of times before emigrating, like so many other people my age, going to see old movies at the Illusion movie theater. But anyway, on that occasion, I was there to interview Stalin's nephew, Leonid Redens. His father, Stanislav Redens, Stanislav in Russian, had been the secret police chief of the Moscow region, among other posts, and one of the most prolific executioners in Russian history. He was eventually shot as a Polish spy. Leonid's mother Stalin's sister-in-law, Anna Alliluyeva, had written a book of memoirs, but Stalin didn't like it and had her put in prison. When she came out, about 6 years later, she could no longer recognize her two children. Leonid, one of those children, Leonid, had been arrested in 1943 when he was 14 or 15 years old for belonging to a secret society called the Fourth Reich. They were playing Nazis. They were all elite kids. Leonid, he was a wonderful storyteller. I spent many hours in that apartment. And when I was leaving, his wife, he and his wife asked me to say hello to their daughter if I happened to run into her in Toronto, where she had emigrated. And about 10 years later, and actually about 10 years ago, Katherine came to Berkeley from Toronto, as it happens. And we had our lunch with a view of the Transamerica Pyramid. And she went on to write a dissertation, which has now become this wonderful, wonderful book, which actually is being translated into Russian as we speak. A book that does a terrific job, I think, of combining architectural, social, and international history. A book that is now a part of my life almost as much as those high rises, actually more so. So I'm here to congratulate Katherine and to look forward to reading it in Russian. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Yuri. It's I think really great to hear those sorts of personal experiences and memories, as horrifying as some of them are, but it helps to bring these buildings, as it were, into 3 dimensions for us here on our Zoom screens. Our next eminent speaker is Caroline Humphrey, who is Professor Emerita at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. Her forthcoming book, written with Frank Billet, is called On the Edge, Life Along the Russia-China Border, which is forthcoming with Harvard University Press in 2021. Her recent books include Trust and Mistrust in the Economies of the Russia-Chinese Borderlands, which appeared in 2018, and A Monastery in Time, The Making of Mongolian Buddhism, with Huralbatar Uyed, I'm probably mispronouncing the name, which appeared in 2013. And her first book was called Karl Marx Collective, Economy, Society, and Religion in a Siberian Collective Farm, which came out with Cambridge in 1983. And a revised edition came out in 1998 with the wonderful title, revised title, Marx Went Away, but Karl Stayed Behind. So Caroline, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. To me, this is a real day of celebration to welcome Michal's book, The Palace Complex. It's transformed, I think, into an eloquent and subtle book since I knew it, because I first knew it as a PhD dissertation. And so things I remember about this dissertation are long disquisitions on Althusser and how to understand in the last instance. They've not completely disappeared, but they've been elegantly integrated into, I think, a far wider range of ideas, especially from critical theories of art and architecture and city planning. So I think, to me, the major achievement of this book is to splendidly show how the opening out of the iconic palace from the socialist to later period to all kinds of new signs and new imaginaries and symbolizations sort of illuminates the tortuous passage of Warsaw itself from socialism to capitalism. Now, reading it again, or looking at it again, I couldn't help being thrown back to my own 1.5 years of living in the 1960s in the Soviet kind of architectural prototype of this kind of building, the Moscow State University. So I'm going to talk in a way, in a slightly similar way to Yuri, what he's just been saying. But I thought that because we're also celebrating a book about Moscow today, and since Michał is interested actually in the impact of buildings on people's bodies and their minds, I thought I'd just entertain you with some kind of comparative points, as I see it, between these two high-rises, which in fact had the same man, Rudnev, as the chief architect of both of them. So I would like to show to a picture now. Can you see this?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Good. So there we are, MGU, as we'd call it. And of course, it's been pointed out already today that it doesn't have the same position in Moscow at all as the palace. But I think perhaps I'd go slightly against what Michał just said in radically differentiating it, because it seemed to me it had an overall similar aim, which was to incorporate everything in this great complex. So the result was, if you're in there, there was kind of unknowable complexity of departments and services and clubs and canteens and congress hall, theaters, sports facilities, hairdressers, etc., etc. And so what it was like living there, and I'm sure actually a lot of other people here have probably lived there too, so I'm not saying anything very new. What it was like was that you couldn't possibly know the whole thing. And so you lived in it by following your own path from the entrance to one or two places that you did know. Now, one thing Michał talks about is the dominating height of these kinds of buildings. I lived on fairly low, really, on the 8th floor of Zone V, but you always had the feeling that something unknown was going on above you. There were these mysterious higher floors, and there was indeed one floor where the lift didn't stop. There was a kind of blanked out knob on that thing where you say where you're going to go. It just didn't stop there. Always a matter of speculation what happened there. And then the central tower itself did seem like a completely separate realm. It had red carpets and chandeliers and that kind of thing. And it was clear that there was some kind of enigmatic superstructure operating up there. And meanwhile, down below in the basement, that was where you got the kind of smelly canteens, the shoe repairs, the boiler rooms, and that kind of thing. So as a whole, the building felt like a kind of material exemplification of a kind of Marxist imagined society. Now, when you were in there, you didn't know what was going to come down from on top. And I remember that you'd be in your room and then vodka bottles would come swooshing past, people tossed them out from somewhere up there, and then they would smash on the ground below like a little bomb. That was a kind of audio vertical that was kind of with you while you were living in this place. And I think it's not exactly that, but something like it must have been experienced in the Warsaw Palace. And Michał shows so often in his book that the tremendous efforts people made to subvert that psychological effect of this verticality. And I've just understood today that this is kind of ongoing project where it's now called perverting, but anyway, subverting, perverting, that's really interesting. Now, another thing about the building is it's, perhaps I should move on. Yep. How do I go to another slide? Oh, well, perhaps it doesn't really matter. I've got it. This one will have to do. So symmetry is another point that Michał talks about. Sort of sameness over the quarters of these places you get in both MGO and in the palace. And I remember, and this may be only a story, but it seemed quite realistic to me, that you could actually arrive home late at night at this building, maybe you had a drink or two or whatever, and you go on autopilot, you take the lift up to 8th floor, you open the door to room 38, that was my room, only to find that somebody was in bed there, and actually it wasn't your room. You were in zone B and not zone V. So Michał's book, I think, discusses the battles in Warsaw over symmetry, because it's clear that some people loved it and some wanted, really, they couldn't stand it, wanted to change it or hide it in other sort of forms, other kinds of geometries. But then there were the people who wanted not only to have it in the building, but to extend it outwards from the building into Warsaw itself through the streetscape. And you can see from this photo, in fact, that although it's not a streetscape, that this MGO building also extends its kind of geometrical shapes into the landscape around it. Another point I'd like to make briefly is about closedness and openness, which has also been mentioned earlier. MGO was actually a rather closed building. It had very few entrances. Of course, you needed a special permit to get into it. And inside it was quite bleak and orderly. There were very few places for sort of informal gatherings. On every floor, there was a dejurner, a person who would be keeping watch that the students were observing the regulations and noting who came in and out. So this building in itself, to my mind, didn't encourage great sociability, because you either already knew friends there, or if you would make new friends, you do it somewhere else, but you somehow it wasn't a place where you particularly met people to make new friends inside the building. And it was kind of internalized in the kind of ways that the students inside thought about it and talked about it. So for example, there was inside this entrance place, you can see here, there were great big revolving doors that you had to go through. They were very, very heavy to push. And people used to say that, you know, thousands of students would push them every day and go through, that this would produce electricity, and this electricity would then be used to to power the lift. So I think an internal sort of thing going on. So this was a closed building, a guarded building. So kind of you were terribly safe from anything from outside, but all the same you felt a bit vulnerable, perhaps because, mainly because any key practically could open any door. So anybody could wander into your room. And it was also full of surveillance, of course, and we foreign students were definitely under surveillance. So living in there, the main aim was actually to get out, at least it was for me. I think a lot of people. My main friend there was Sheila Fitzpatrick, who Yuri Slezkine will know very well. She and I actually used to get out of this place early in the morning and only get back late at night, if at all, because I tried to stay with some Russian friends in Moscow. So I think by contrast with that, which was maybe something about that was what the gift was supposed to bring to Warsaw, what we see from Michał's book is a total contrast, really. So as you move into the post-socialist era, there are businesses installed in there, theaters and all kinds of events. People are invited in. They're invited, furthermore, to give their opinions, to take part in events. This is the Warsaw Palace becomes a maximally open place. And of course, Michał himself takes part in this, as he describes in the book. Nevertheless, it wasn't totally privatized, which is another important point I think he makes. It remained, the palace had remained a municipal site, but an open and public-spirited one. And that is why it's so important in Poland today, because as citizens, as he shows very clearly, they take part in the decisions about what's going to go on in there. And then, of course, there's the point that I think I don't really need to make because Michał's already made it so clearly, but one essential difference from MGU and the palace is it's the siting of these buildings. Moscow State University is outside the center of the city and it's perched on some hills, but the palace is totally central. And I'm just going to quote Michał now. He said, it has a magic power of sorts, a kind of architectural magical power, because of the total infrastructure of domination that it establishes in the city. And so it seems to me that if that's right, and I think it is right, it does dominate the city, then what we learn from Michał's book is how much Warsaw owes to the, well, at least currently, open spirit in the way that the palace manages to function. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for those remarks, drawing on the kind of parallels and similarities between the two sites and centers that we've been discussing. And before I go on to read out the questions, and whilst some more questions are coming in from our audience, I would like to ask Michał and Katherine if they would like to make any responses to Yuri's and Caroline's comments. So maybe to Katherine first.
Sure. Well, thank you so much to both of you for your comments. Yuri, that was a real pleasure to hear about the evolution of my path, I guess, to this book, but also set against your own relationship with these buildings. And this is one thing that you know, doesn't make it directly into the book, but something that I was very conscious of while doing this research, and that's that so many people's lives have passed through or alongside these structures in Moscow, and these are very kind of personal places to all of us who've been in that city, even for short periods of time. And so, yeah, I'll just stop there, but thank you very much, Yuri.
Yeah, and thank you very much also to Caroline and to Yuri. And I mean, you made excellent points, a number of excellent points. Carrie, in your analysis of my, your critique of my, this kind of sharp distinction I make between the palace and the Moscow towers is particularly interesting because it was actually presaged by a student of mine who I think is in the audience. I saw her earlier, Chiara Clouseau, who on my cities course, who wrote an essay to that effect, kind of precisely critiquing me for overstating that point and for denigrating the kind of social condenser status of MGU, of the Moscow State University. And I think that's definitely true, and especially having now spent a bit more time in that building, even though you do need to have your billet, you need to have your student ID to get in. So in that sense, it's closed unless you're part of the university. That's definitely something that I need to explore further, and its sort of pivotal role in the urban morphology of Moscow is very marked too. And the one thing that the palace doesn't have, that it absolutely lacks, is the fact that people don't live there. So this experience of being in your bedroom and hearing a vodka bottle explode on the ground at night isn't something that people have there. There's one bedroom in the Palace of Culture which is lived in by, which is a guest bedroom in the Dramatic Theatre, which is rarely used today. But it doesn't have this experience of residence, which is certainly one part of the social sort of condensatory experience of the palace that the Warsaw lacks. And there's lots of excellent. I mean, there's lots of other things that I wanted to respond to, but in particular, I suppose I'd mention your extraordinary invocation of getting lost in the Block Ver and Block Bear and trying to find room 38, which, as you, I'm sure, consciously made this with reference perhaps to Ironia Subita, to the irony of fate, which was mentioned by one of the comments from Lukas Novotny. And it's quite interesting that I suppose it's not this symmetry and this repeatability in what Alexei Yuchak called this hypernormalization of Soviet affect or of aesthetic. Sorry, my computer is ringing me for some reason. Is not necessarily purely a characteristic of modernism, but it can also be a characteristic of Stalinist socialist realism. So that's a very important and interesting observation. And I'm sorry, Yuri, that my book hasn't reached you yet. It's taken weeks, but we can blame Brexit for that, I suppose. So thank you very much to both. And I've been wanting to have an excuse to hear more of your stories from MGU, Caroline. So this is finally, we finally had to bring 100 people into the room to make that happen. So do you think we should go? There's a lot of excellent questions from the audience as well. Masha, what do you think we should do?
Yeah, I think we should probably take questions from the chat function. Begin with the questions from the chat, and I'm happy to read several at a time, and then we'll see where we are and if anyone wants to speak their question. So the first question is from Abdul Kutab. Why is the dichotomy drawn between East and West and not North and South? Doesn't that just constrain the conversation into a Eurocentric one, since the East-West dichotomy here is, I presume, between Eastern and Western Europe? So that's a question from Abdul. And a second question is from Lukas Novotny, who's already been mentioned. And his question is for Katherine: were the skyscrapers constructed in the traditional way using bricks, or rather than the modern steel skeleton? Question mark. So over to you. I don't know who wants to. Maybe the practical question can be answered first by Katherine, and then you can tackle the bigger question.
Sure, thanks, Masha. Yes, thanks for the question, Lucas. They are built with modern steel skeletons, these structures, and there are really interesting discussions among the engineers of these buildings about how non-American these are. So it's not just that they're not American in their sort of aesthetics, allegedly, but they're also not American in their structure. And there's a kind of great lengths gone to in some of these internal discussions among engineers about how Soviet the steel skeletons are that support these buildings. So.
That suggests that I should tackle the Global South question.
Yeah, if you don't, I wonder, it's a great question, Abdul. I mean, yeah, the East-West and not North-South. Do you want to go ahead, Michał?
I mean, I suppose because we're in this Moscow-Warsaw conversation, so we're in this kind of we're in a high Stalinist Cold War conversation here, and we're kind of we're in a sort of some sort of binarist dichotomous Cold War mindset. So maybe that's somehow coming across in the content and in the character of the conversation. But definitely the way that, well, PPV in particular uses the notion of the global East is consciously derivative of the idea of the global South. So in a sense, the idea of the global East, which I'm not entirely convinced by, it's an idea that's first and foremost promoted by Martin Muller and Jelena Trubina and by a group of political geographers. I'm not entirely convinced by the usefulness of that idea, but I suppose the idea is that it's a way of entering the post-socialist world into a conversation with the decolonizing world or with the post-colonial world. And of course, this conversation has been attempted and has been tried and has been moved forward for some time, but we still haven't gotten to a place where it naturally can take place. And I mean, there have been several recent works of scholarship in architectural history, for example, which have been perhaps the most successful in making these East-South juxtapositions. For example, Łukasz Stanek's Architecture for Global Socialism, which is a book about East European architects' work and engineers' work in the global South. But this is also a conversation that the Institute for Advanced Studies and that CEAS and that UCL are institutionally kind of committed to trying to move forward. So to build these terrains for East-South conversations is something that we're consciously working on doing with Diane and with Peter and with Nicola and with Masha and with others. So yeah, we're working on it. And I suppose actually there's a neo-Stalinist palace in Soviet Central Asia, in post-Soviet Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, which you mentioned, I think, right, Katherine, in the final chapter of your
Very
book.
briefly, yeah, in Astana. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's a building that looks remarkably like a kind of 3 times higher version of the Moscow State University in Mecca, right outside the overlooking the Kaaba. There is this sort of 680 meter high version of the Palace of Culture of Moscow State University, which it may or may not be socialist realist in its inspiration. So there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had.
Great. Thank you so much for those responses. So I'll move over to the next questions. Let me just find them. Okay, so I have a question from Kathleen Smith for Michał. Was elite housing being built in Warsaw in the same period? And a question from Christina Crawford: Is there a palaces complex in Moscow? If so, in what ways does it differ from Warsaw's?
Well, maybe I'll take Christina's question, which is a great one. And I think that there is a bit of a palace complex in Moscow as well, right? And I think it stretches beyond Moscow too. We've brought up the Palace of Soviets numerous times today. That sort of lurks behind Stalinist architecture generally. If you actually Google or do a Google image search for Palace of Soviets Moscow present or something, Moscow today, you can actually pull up a number of images in which people have photoshopped the palace into contemporary Moscow. And I find those images really fascinating because they're actually part of a much longer process of imagining the building as though it had been built. And you can see that right from the 1930s with, of course, the films like Michiskaya and other films that act as though the palace already exists in Moscow. And so I think that in the sense that it was a building that was always supposed to be part of this sort of bright communist future, and you're always striving towards, maybe there's some elements of that striving that continue into the present. Thanks, Christina.
And I mean, I suppose, yeah, briefly, the main palace, it's sort of this, if you say the word palace in a city, which palace is being talked about? And in Poland, most of the time, it's the Palace of Culture. But I suppose if you say the word palace or dvoriec in Moscow now, then the conversation is likely to be about a particular palace built in Gelendzhik on the Black Sea coast more recently. So perhaps if there's a palace complex in Russia now, it relates to the summer residence or not of the head of state. But yeah, and with regards to elite housing, it was being built in Warsaw during this period, just down the road from the Palace of Culture. There were some sort of Stalinist 1940s, 1950s socialist realist elite flats, but they were not they looked much more impressive from the outside than they looked inside, and they were nothing near as elite as those apartments inside that are so beautifully described by Katherine inside in the Katerinskaya Nabrzhnaya or in the other towers in Moscow. So I was shocked when I went into and I spent quite a lot of time in some of these flats in Moscow during my field work there, and I was amazed at the level of kind of bourgeois trappings inside those flats. The fact that they have not just corridors but enfilades linking the rooms in a way that would have been dismissed as completely reactionary by an architect in the 1920s or 30s, and by these sort of heavy wood fittings, etc. So yeah, there was housing built for the elite of the time, but it was nothing like the Moscow housing.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question is from Catriona Kelly, and I'm going to read it out. It's often argued that the Moscow Vysotki had analogues in, say, 17th century 10 churches. Do we have evidence from architectural criticism, planning, diaries, and other contemporary sources that this was a current perception at the time? How was the palace complex in Warsaw received in similar places? At the same time they were built, that is. So that's from Catriona. And then a question from Jonathan Bach. The gift of the palace to Warsaw was a form of architectural diplomacy, distributing Moscow, so to speak. Prefabricated housing blocks were later also a kind of export. Can we think of the tall buildings and the prefabricated block as two different poles of a kind of attempt at architectural hegemony? So over to Michał and Katherine.
Okay. Well, to take Catriona's question first, which is a great one. It's a great question. I think that I'd have to go back and look through the documents. What comes to mind, though, immediately is discussions having to do with the first design proposals of the buildings that come in starting in the fall of 1947. And there is concern that some of these structures resemble churches. I don't recall any direct references to the tent churches, 17th century tent churches, but this is a moment when the kind of architectural historical canon is being kind of rewritten in the Soviet Union, so that while it may have been appropriate even in the 1930s to make those kinds of references, although no, probably not to tent churches, but to make kind of references to broader European trends in architecture by the post-war Stalin era, it's really kind of, it's really about creating linkages with the Russian past. So having the towers mimic the towers of the Kremlin, rather than kind of reaching out beyond the borders of the former Russian Empire. For references. Yeah, and then in terms of Jonathan Bach's question, I think, yeah, absolutely. It makes total sense to think of the prefabricated block coming later on, and then the Vysotki in the late 40s and moving into the 50s as products for export, right? Things that are supposed to be duplicated across the socialist world to signal membership in a socialist sphere and kind of connection back to Moscow.
And yeah, thanks for that question. And I mean, that's in a way, it's perhaps a question for an architectural historian, but in terms of responses to the sacral quality I mean, not necessarily in terms of the inspiration by 17th century tent churches, but I do have interlocutors in Moscow who are very interested in this link. But in Warsaw, certainly the Palace of Culture was received by its first users, by visitors was represented as being in particular perceived by visitors from the countryside as a church. And there are stories of, in diaries rather than in the press of the time, of peasants been taken on tours of various grandiose rooms within the Palace of Culture and spontaneously getting down on their feet and kneeling and praying. And in particular in these two halls inside the Palace of Culture, which have this massively church-like character. So there was definitely a socialist church-esque quality of the palace. And for Jonathan, yes, but the thing is, I mean, I think that's a great question. But the thing is, again, I'm not a historian of prefabricated panel housing. So I'm sure there's a bunch of people in the audience, I know that there are, who can probably correct me, but most of the socialist bloc countries had a fair degree of autonomy and some kind of autochthonous capacity for prefabrication. So in Poland, the prefabricated housing that was built from the late 50s onwards wasn't built in the same DSKs, in the same house factory, quite the same technology as in the Soviet bloc. So the prefabricated diplomacy was distributed kind of unevenly. But it's important also to recognize that the Palace of Culture, although it's a steel and brick structure, has a lot of prefabricated elements too.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to take 3 questions next. There is a question from Gabriel Leo Berti. Can we consider the Stalinist skyscrapers as heterotopias? If yes, did their heterotopic qualities change? If no, why? And a question from Anna Bokov for both Michał and Katherine. Michał, you described the Palace of Culture as a social condenser, a term introduced by the constructivist architects to describe the functionalist structures they were designing. One of their main postulates was the highly articulate and interdependent relationship between form and function. The relationship between function and form in Stalinist Vysoka, of course, is not nearly as obvious and is far more complex. How would you describe it? Are there formal patterns that you see with regards to functionality of condensation? And then there is a response from Andrzej Nowak to the East, West, South, North discussion. Should we not be talking about the strange and surprising disappearance of the Second World rather than the North-South divide? And is this maybe a good time to stop? Take these questions? Okay, great. So over to you, Katherine and Michał.
You want to jump in first, Michał?
Okay, yeah, I was kind of luxuriating in the fact that we seem to have established a tradition whereby you speak first, but I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think, Gabriel, about the heterotopias, I think one could describe them as heterotopias. I'm resistant to the idea of heterotopia for some reason, whether in its Lefebvrean and in its Foucauldian incarnations. But I think that they are definitely islands, or in Warsaw, in Warsaw, the Palace of Culture and the area surrounding it certainly has some kind of autonomy and has some sort of temporal otherness in connection, in comparison to the surrounding city. But I think that yeah, one can certainly use that idea to describe them. And then, I mean, Anna's question, and also I highly recommend for everyone Anna Bokor's new book on Vchutemas, this extraordinary study of Vchutemas, which I haven't got my hands on yet, but I hope to soon. And Anna also contributed to our special issue on the social condenser of the Journal of Architecture from 2017. And actually, I think that the story that Caroline told about the revolving doors in the Moscow State University powering the lifts, if I understood it correctly, that they were said to kind of, that there was a joke that they generated electricity for the lifts to run, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Which is precisely the social condenser is a metaphor for how these buildings generate a kind of electricity, or a kind of ideological electricity. And I suppose that may be one way of that metaphor being expressed. But it's interesting that you said in your response, Caroline, that you don't, compared to your analysis of the kind of communal quality of the общежитие, that you in your analysis of literature, right, written about the student dorms, that you didn't feel that actually in that kind of spontaneous collectivity being lived in MGU, in Moscow State University. So there was less of a social condenser. Yes.
Well, the article about the other общежитие was not written about MGU, but about other ones I've lived in, which were very differently planned and were built probably, I think, in the 1960s or something like that, which there were shared rooms, so you would be in a room already with 4 people or 6 people or something like that. And they were much more sociable, whereas MGU, you had a single room, maybe shared with one in a little block next door to another person, but you didn't even have to see very much of them. And no, it was a very, very different sort of feel to it. And anyway, I'm talking about way, way, way back in the 1960s and the archetypal socialist time, as opposed to the later thing, which was more about, I must have been about the 1980s or 90s, when things were a bit different.
But I mean, I think I suppose it's interesting that, you had your individual rooms in MGU, or your rooms shared with 2 people. So in a sense, the 1960s structures here were more social condensatory or collectivity generators than the Stalinist structures. And the question about form and the relationship between function and form and condensation, I'm going to have to think about that for some time to deliver a response. That's hi, Anna.
Hi, thank you so much.
What do you think? What do you think about your own? How would you answer your own question?
You know, I asked it because I'm thinking about it now. I think it's an important one, and I agree that it is a condenser. I mean, full disclosure, I actually went to the same kindergarten as Yuri, and my grandmother grew up. My grandmother was living in one of those in the Vysotka building on Kudrinskaya. So it's too close of a place still, like Katherine mentioned. So many people are affected by this. So I'm certainly in that camp for sure. But it is an important question. Like, I think it's not about function, obviously. It is about form, which is ironic because they are the ultimate critics of formalism, right? That whole period is all about anti-formalism, and yet those buildings are, I think, epitome of formalism as such. So it's oxymoron. But good to see you, and thank you for this event. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And congratulations on your book, Anna. And I just wanted to add on the form and function as it relates to the Vysotki in Moscow. You can see the way in which the functions are really interchangeable. So, whether a building is going to be a hotel or a residential building or an office structure or a combination of 2, depends, that varies. So the locations are chosen for the buildings, and some of them change function during the design process. So MGU was not supposed to be a university initially, and then it became one. So there's a kind of a way in which the function is irrelevant or an afterthought. And it's about kind of creating these cityscape objects and beautifying the city foremost.
Super, thank you so much. Got two more questions, one from Christoph Bruman. How good were these skyscrapers in terms of infrastructure with high rises, water pipes, heating, electricity, garbage, elevators? Are always a technical challenge. How well did these work and how much did failures in this regard dominate the user resident experience? Question mark. And a comment from Peter Zusi. This is probably an obvious link, but the New York Gothic skyscrapers, such as the Woolworth building, were clearly models. No? Question mark, despite the claims to reject connection with American skyscrapers. And let's see if there was another, yeah. So over to you.
Okay, maybe I'll jump in on the infrastructure question. One of the initial goals with these buildings was that they would be using the latest advances in infrastructure, in in everything you mentioned. So electricity, elevators, water pipes, garbage, etc. But of course, this was a struggle in a moment when it wasn't possible to kind of go abroad anymore in the same way that it would have been in the 30s to go and learn these technologies or import these. So you can see kind of technical manuals being imported for elevators, say from Otis or other kinds of companies, to use these technical manuals to try and kind of figure out how to implement this technology and these sort of modern amenities were what these buildings were supposed to offer their residents, for the residential ones or their visitors if they're hotels. And so this was an important part of the story, but there's a bit of a struggle when it comes to actually implementing all of the latest advances. And then in terms of the Woolworth building, yeah, absolutely. In the book, I look at Palace of Soviets architects who travel to New York City. Just looking for Peter, I don't know where, oh, there you are. Who travel to New York City to learn about skyscraper building in the 1930s. And they're visiting structures like the Woolworth building, or the Rockefeller Center is another one that's really important for them because it's under construction, so they can see a large scale building project, much like the Palace of Soviets, that serves a range of purposes, being built in New York, and watch kind of the managerial practices of how you kind of deal with the logistics of building such a structure. So absolutely, that's an important precedent.
Perhaps I could just quickly jump in on that too, because in my experience, the infrastructure worked really well. I mean, I never remember there being any problem with heating or lighting or drains or anything like that. It was pretty simple, I think, the way it worked. And the kitchens and bathrooms were really basic, but they worked well. And there must have been, I guess, real attention paid to this, a whole service sector, which I never sort of noticed really, but there must have been a whole army of people who were keeping a building like the MGO going in this way. And I think that is an element of it, obviously being an elite building in the Soviet general kind of city structure of where you put your money. They must have, but we have to invest in keeping this place working really well, but it did work well, which is very different from later periods. I mean, I don't know about MGO in later periods, but other общежития, of course, later on in the late Soviet and period, of course, were not like that at all.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, if I may jump in with my reflections on the present, and certainly the Palace of Culture is well maintained, and it has a big budget, and it's got an enormous staff, and it's a well-financed operation to keep the Palace of Culture internally and externally functioning. In contrast to the square around it, to this empty parade square around it, which is dilapidated and temporary and kind of ripped apart. But the actual body of the building itself is infrastructurally very sound. And this is an interesting, I mean, in terms of the other sense of the word infrastructure, the sort of Marxian sense of the infrastructure as in the base superstructure relationship. These buildings are often represented as being epitomes of the way in which, in fact, the Soviet project was all about superstructure rather than infrastructure. So they are represented as epitomizing the manner in which actually existing socialism reversed the Marxian relationship between base and superstructure and built the superstructure without doing the infrastructure. And I think that actually the well-oiled manner in which at least these buildings function suggests that there is some sort of infrastructural quality to them too. And I know that this is a metaphor that Yuri develops in his book in the House of Government, and explicitly kind of brings out at the end the way in which the House of Government had this sort of had this kind of infrastructure building, or build a kind of cosmos on the basis of some sort of infrastructure. So I think it's possible to treat these towers, both in Moscow and Warsaw, both as metaphors of a particularly bureaucratic, centralized interpretation of Marxist-Leninism, but also as infrastructures which actually worked and which actually conveyed some sort of energy to each other, and which in some sense survived and continue to function beyond the fall of state socialism, in contrast to the way in which the Palace of Culture was. I don't know whether there's an equivalent to this in the Moscow context, but in the representation, in the sort of dissident or satirical literature and popular culture of the 70s or 80s, the demise of the Polish People's Republic is often represented in terms of the destruction of the Palace of Culture. So you have this famous scene in a film called Calls Controlled by, I've forgotten the name of the director. It's not Barea, is it? Never mind. Where the lead character, who's hiding from the secret police in a toilet in the Palace of Culture, pulls the plug in order to distract the policeman, the militiaman who's running to find him, and the pulling of the plug is enough to bring apart the collapse of the entire building. But quite in contrast, the collapse of the regime, in fact, kind of reinforced the power of or the complex of the palace. So this question of infrastructure is very interesting, I think, beyond also the actual working of the pipes and the floorboards.
Just to also do a shout out to another book that was recently published by Yale University Press by Jean-Louis Cohen on Americanism in Russian architecture, Building a New World, which speaks of the relationship between, or the kind of the fascination with America and the exchange between America and the Soviet Union.
Can I just say that actually really the chapter in Katherine's book on the travels to America is quite extraordinary in terms of laying home the much more so in fact than in Jean-Louis Cohen's book, which doesn't really focus on this aspect so much. But Katherine, you really showed the extent, the lengths to which the ideologues of the time went to define the Soviet Vysotka in opposition to the capitalist Nieboskryb, the kind of the dialectical machinations that had to be performed in order to distinguish these towers from American towers are quite impressive. So yeah, it's definitely worth reading that chapter to get a sense of this sort of the ideological undertaking that had to be done in order to show that these are in fact not American skyscrapers.
Yeah, thanks, Michał. Yeah, it was impressive also to read in files where you can see in internal conversations that word Nieboskryb slipping in early on. They know that they're building skyscrapers, but they're not able to kind of publicly say that. So yeah, totally fascinating.
This builds on kind of the conversation. There is a comment and question from Anna Branavitskaya, the main function of the Moscow Vysotki was to make the city readable again, to create a system of vertical landmarks to replace the old bell towers that were either demolished or hidden by taller buildings. On the urban scale, they definitely work as large churches, and the Palace of Culture was meant to be a modern secular cathedral. Would you agree?
I mean, I would definitely agree with that. And reading Bruno Taut's pamphlet on the Stadtkrone, the city crown, in which he argues in 1909 or 1911, whenever it was published, that the coming socialist city would require a cathedral, would require that the new Christianity, socialism, as Bruno Taut called it, would require a cathedral at its center. That was what the Palace of Soviets was supposed to be, and I think that's what the Palace of Culture is in Warsaw. And I don't know, I think probably this is just a kind of structural reason why these types of government structures required a cathedral, but I suppose maybe it's also possible to trace some kind of impact of Bruno Taut's own presence in Moscow, or his conversations with city planners on the kind of cathedralization of Stalinist architecture. But I don't know, maybe this has been researched by someone.
Yes, I agree as well with that reading, that it's all about, you know, thinking of the city from the bird's eye view, right? And kind of placing these buildings in the city in such a way that it makes them, as you're saying, so eloquently here, Anna, legible, right? That it can be read both to foreign eyes, right? It's legible to foreigners. You can recognize big, impressive buildings and what that means when you're reading what Moscow is and what the Soviet state has become by the post-war period. But also legible to local residents who can then kind of live their lives in relation to these structures.
Great, thank you so much. There are a couple of other comments that I encourage you to, or kind of questions and answers that speak about the attempts to turn these buildings into heritage in the chat, that I don't think I need to read out personally, but this has been definitely a fascinating discussion. So I just wanted to pass over to Michał and ask if we have time for any more questions, and how you want to and Katherine, how you want to run this.
I mean, if there are more questions, I'd be happy to continue the conversation, but I suppose I don't want to also create a sense of obligation on people that they have to stick around for almost 2 hours. So maybe it is perhaps it's time to wrap up. But there were, I mean, I just wanted to mention with regard to Christoph's comment about nominating these buildings for the World Heritage List. That's a good idea. Maybe we can team up, Katherine, and see if we can do something about that.
Let's do that, yeah.
The Palace of Culture, actually, this is a question that I had for, I'm sure Anna Branavitskaya or Katherine, perhaps you can answer this, because the Palace of Culture was written into the heritage list of the city of Warsaw in 2007, and so now it's very difficult to demolish it. But I don't know what the historical protection is afforded to the Vysotki is.
I actually don't know either. Maybe someone else on the line knows if Anna Branavitskaya is still here. It's a question. I'll look it up later. It's a great question.
Catriona said that in reply to Christoph's question, some Stalin-era buildings were already listed in Leningrad during 1970s, and I suspect the Moscow Vysotki among them. UNESCO has very specific stipulations about alteration, use, and surrounding environment.
Oh, Anna knows.
Can I?
Mm-hmm.
Please.
All Moscow Vysotki are listed. Yes. and I think on a high level of protection.
Yeah.
And when did this happen?
I think in the 80s, already in the 80s. Mhm.
Okay, that's really fascinating. Yeah, the history of the heritagization of these buildings is also an uneven and a complex one. So that's another book.
Michał, as a way of wrapping up and saying goodbye to everyone, do you think you could just say a few words about our next book launch, which is happening next week?
Yes, yeah, thank you. The good point. The next book launch, which is happening on Friday next week, is for a book that's also co-edited by myself with Jonathan Bach, who was here earlier, called Recentering the City: Global Mutations of Socialist Modernity. So in terms of Southeast conversations, I suppose I should have mentioned that this is a book that tries to center the perspective of the global South and the global East on urban history, or on urbanism, rather than that of the whatever isn't the global South or the global East, the global compass point that shall not be named. And we will have at this launch about 15 of our contributors making 1-minute presentations, including, so I don't know how that's going to go, including Vladimir Papierny, Andreas Schönler, Dasha Paramonova, and Jonas Tinius, who's here now, and I mean a whole bunch of fantastic presenters, and we'll have responses too from Keller Easterling, from Jennifer Robinson from UCL, from Kimberly Zareko, who I believe was one of your respondents at your Harriman Institute event, Katherine, recently, and Solomon Benjamin from the Institute of Technology, the Madras Institute of Technology in Chennai. So that's on the 26th. And then there'll be another book launch for Keti Chukhrov's book, excellent new book called Practicing the Good, which will take place in May. And another book launch at some point in April, which is yet to be announced. So there's an exciting program of book launches, and also the IAS has an absolutely extraordinary program of book launches coming up. So I advise you to check out the Institute for Advanced Studies website, as well as the CEAS website. there's a lot of book launches.
So basically, a whole party of book launches. Please continue to join us for many of those events. Katherine has posted the website ppv.life, where you can also sign up to our newsletter, to our mailing list. But I think now I'd just like to thank all our speakers today, and especially Katherine and Michał, to congratulate you on the publication of your books. The world is a better place, definitely, with the books with us, and also to thank Yuri and Caroline for your responses. So I'm so sorry we can't cheers everyone with glasses of wine. We would be pouring them out. Oh, there we go. But an applause, and we will see you soon.
Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for coming in such huge numbers and staying put throughout the discussion.
Yes.
Thank you, Michał. It was great.
Thank you, Carrie, so much, and thank you, Yuri, for your.
Thank you, Yuri.
Look forward to continuing in IRL soon.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michał.